Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, how are you doing?
I'm just waiting for this general election to end, Michael. There's only so much polling data one woman can take.
You seem ever so just marginally more chirpy than Rishi Sunak. You don't seem like you're enjoying this election much more than him, I have to say. But we do have lots of great stories to discuss this evening. Some manifestos, we've got more of them. The SNP and the Workers Party of Britain have released theirs today. Mehdi Hasan gets booed for quoting Oxfam to a pro-Israel audience. They'll boo anything now. And a lifelong Tory-supporting billionaire has joined the Starmer train. He makes some interesting arguments. He was on Newsnight last night. Interesting fellow. Threatened to leave the country to go to Monaco to avoid taxes rising under Corbyn. It's not looking good for Mr. Sunak. Two MRP mega polls have just dropped this afternoon, and they project a Tory wipeout. Now, unlike regular polls, MRPs, they provide a projection of specifically how many seats each party is on track to win. They do it based on the demographics in each seat. And unless things change for Sunak's Tories, it's looking pretty bleak for them. So firstly, YouGov spoke to 35,000 people. It's a lot of people. And they came out with this result. So it has the Conservatives winning around just 100 seats, making it their worst performance in the party's near 200-year history. Now, to put those losses in context, it would see half the cabinet losing their seats, with senior Tories like Jeremy Hunt, Penny Mordaunt, Grant Shapps and Robert Jenrick all being kicked out of Parliament. So pretty bad for the Conservatives. It could get worse for them, though. Another pollster, this time Savanta, they also released an MRP poll this afternoon, and it has the Conservatives winning just 53 seats. The poll was for the Telegraph, and here's their headline: Sunak to lose seat in Tory wipeout, major poll predicts. So if this MRP poll turns out to be correct, then Rishi Sunak himself would lose his seat, which might be some good news for him, to be fair, because that would mean that he could go off to LA without having to worry about sort of people complaining about it or saying that he was never really interested in the job in his first place. So in this Savanta poll, they say Labour will win 516 seats, with the Conservatives on 53 and the Lib Dems on 50. Now, interestingly, obviously this is a bad poll for the Conservatives. It gives Reform 0 seats. I'm not sure how plausible I find this one. But Ash, and there have been 3 MRP polls today, actually, one by More in Common as well. They all have the Tories on somewhere between 53 seats and 150 seats. I suppose, does it really matter where the Tories fall on that spectrum, or is just a loss?
At the start of this election, the nightmare scenario for the Conservative Party was winning a 140 seats. Now, when you look at projections which suggest that they might go as low as, 55, 53 seats, you really think, oh my God, you should have taken that 140. I think that perhaps there's a degree. There are some polls where there's something in me where I go, I'm not so sure about that. One of the things that I'm not so sure about is Reform not winning any seats. I think that the personal celebrity of Nigel Farage will do a lot for him in Clacton. Also, the fact that the anti-reform vote will be split between Labour and the Conservatives sort of suggests to me that Reform might come and sneak through. And also might be other seats where Reform do all right as well. I think in Ashfield, it's unclear to me whether Lee Anderson will be able to hang on to his seat. The projections suggest Labour, but he's also running against an independent candidate who locally has a lot of name recognition. Barnsley, maybe, might go Reform. So the idea that they're not going to win anything, I don't really believe. And the idea that Rishi Sunak might be the first Prime Minister in history to lose his seat, my predictions are always wrong, as we saw just a week ago when I said that Reform weren't going to overtake the Tories in the polls, and it happened the very next day. And in the spirit of making another probably wrong prediction, I don't think that Rishi Sunak is going to lose his seat. I just don't think it's going to happen. I want it to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. Why is it that the polls are showing such a poor showing for the Tories. I think it's deeply connected to what you've just been talking about, Michael, which is the cost of living and who it's affecting. So the governments, not just the Conservatives, but governments in general, are able to do a lot of really, really, really bad things to populations when they can manage to achieve a sort of consensus by protecting certain people's interests. So for the Conservative Party, since 2010, it's been an all-out attack on the poor, an all-out attack on the young. But in the era of low interest rates, there was, okay, well, if you're a homeowner, you're going to do all right. You're going to do all right. We're going to protect those low interest rates. Your asset is going to appreciate in value. So you've got this asset which is going up in value. Money is basically free. It's free to borrow. And that's going to insulate you somewhat from public services being utterly ripped to shreds. Now, the era of low interest rates was always going to come to an end. Liz Truss absolutely hastened that process along. And though when you don't have effectively free money anymore, and people's mortgage repayments are suddenly, excruciatingly expensive, particularly for people who stretched to borrow, right? That their income can't accommodate, an extra, few £1,000s a year, right? They simply can't do that. Then there's nothing to insulate you from the pervasive sense of decline, the sense that nothing works, the sense that every single public service that you're accessing is worse than it was 14 years ago. And that's the thing, is that you can have a high tax society, you can have a bad public service society, you can have a expensive credit society. You're in real trouble when you've got free, and that's what the Conservatives have produced.
Before these polls came out, he did have to face the public. And in fact, he did potentially finally have some good news to talk about. Inflation has hit the Bank of England's 2% target. It means that headline inflation in the UK is now below that of the United States and the Eurozone. This is what Rishi Sunak wanted to tell the public. The problem for the Conservatives is that with overall prices still 20% higher than they were in 2021, people still feel poorer under this Tory government. In fact, they still are poorer under this government, even if inflation is now at a low level because prices are so much higher than they were a couple of years ago. In his 1-hour phone-in with LBC this morning, the public weren't congratulating Rishi Sunak.
Frankly, I think you're lying through your teeth a bit. You've had a decade and a half to improve housing, to improve rental conditions, to improve any of the issues I've talked about and haven't. And I think that young people just don't believe your promises anymore.
Well, final response. Yeah, I'm sorry you feel like that, Ellen, and I'm probably not going to be able to convince you otherwise.
You and your party chose to take money from Frank Hester, who we know has made racist comments, and I quote, "Diane Abbott makes me want to hate all black women and that she should be shot." This effectively means that every Tory candidate and activist is, in some way, funded by racist money. How does this fit with your promise regarding integrity and accountability? And just saying that Frank Hester apologised really won't cut it.
Prime Minister. Well, what he said was wrong. It was unacceptable, and I know it was incredibly hurtful, and that's why it was right that he apologised.
I would like to understand how our National Health Service has gone from 5 stars to 1 star in 10 to 12 years. My partner was treated for cancer 12 years ago and received care that was second to none. When I was diagnosed in 2021, the care has deteriorated. It's so bad, I'm frightened.
Teresa, what is your condition? I'm sorry to talk over you.
Breast cancer.
Thank you, go on.
Breast cancer.
Okay, go on. Yep. And your treatment?
Has been horrible.
Right.
I had no fear about going into hospital because of the treatment my partner received years ago.
Right.
I thought, oh, great, I'm getting treated in that same hospital. Everything's going to be fantastic. There's no staff around. The hospital's dirty. I'm frightened to go in there.
It has been difficult. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I think you said you got your diagnosis in the middle of the pandemic, and we saw an enormous disruption in the number of people being referred for treatment, particularly for cancer during the pandemic. It was just one of the consequences of the NHS having to deal with COVID, and that's something that we're still recovering from now.
It was an hour long, that LBC interview. I could have chosen many questions to put into that little comp because no one was calling up with any kind of positive sentiment towards Rishi Sunak. It was a very punishing phone-in. Lots of people have called this a punishment beating, this election. I mean, that's clearly what it is, isn't it? I mean, if at the end of it, Rishi Sunak loses his seat, as I say, I'm not entirely convinced by the MRP poll from Savanta, especially actually because it doesn't have Reform winning any seats. And I really do think that Nigel Farage is going to win in Clacton, right? That seems to me almost dead cert. So I'm not sure how much I buy this. I mean, it would be interesting to see if it might well be the case, because MRP polls, what they do is they sort of, they poll a really wide variety of people, and then they work out what are people from different demographics likely to vote. So they say, oh, if I've answered the call, they say this 34-year-old, university education, lives in London, wouldn't work because you can't put it needs to be without geography. White, I suppose. I say, well, he says he's voting Labour this time. So let's look at all the 34-year-olds who went to university, white people, who are they going to vote for this time around? And then they say they're all Labour. So they look at your demographics, they look at the demographics of seats and guess who's going to win. So it's not based on individual personalities in particular seats. So, for example, it's not going to get right if Elijah Shaheen will win, or whether George Galloway will, or potentially if Nigel Farage has a large personal vote, whether he'll win in Clacton. It would be interesting if, one of the more positive polls for the Conservatives came true, where they win about 150 seats, but actually Rishi Sunak personally underperforms because people in his constituency would just love to see him lose. That would be very entertaining to see. Although for him, potentially, it would be a relief. Who knows? Let's look at one more question and answer from that LBC phone-in.
Currently, we have 3 million people using food banks. In 2010, there were 35 food banks, and today it stands at nearly 1,200. This affects every single person in the UK. I work in the health service. I work with children who are suffering daily. They aren't able to eat. They're expected to go to secondary school, primary school with hardly any food. It affects the health service because we have poorly children who are unable to get the nutrition that they require. How, as a Prime Minister who is richer than the King, can relate to any of our needs and struggles?
Prime Minister.
Sophie, when it comes to food banks, I'm always incredibly grateful to everyone who supports them and make sure that they have the resources they need and the donations and volunteers at them, because they provide a really important service and support to so many vulnerable people across our country.
But what does it
so
say
I'm
about the
grateful
state
to
of the
everyone
country that we have so many now? This explosion to 1,200, Prime Minister.
And I want to get the number down. And that's why this election is about building people's financial security.
I supported food banks myself, but with a mortgage increase of £700 a month as a health professional, I'm going to struggle to help other people. Right. I don't think that you understand what it's like to be on the shop floor, so to speak. You're richer than the King. I don't believe that you understand how hard it is for people to support food banks. Okay. We need investment and we need the food to come down in price. And
well, not even the Prime Minister, except he doesn't control food prices. Do you accept you're rich, Prime Minister?
Yeah, yes, but I didn't. I'm very fortunate in my life. I have been, right, and I think that's the type. I'm not going to apologise for that because my parents worked really hard to give me and my brother and sister a good life. How does that affect you relating to ordinary folk? Is it a hindrance? I think people can see my actions.
Okay, final question.
So I want to make sure I can cut people's taxes. Okay. Everything that Sophie just described would be made worse if Labour were in power and put up everyone's taxes by £2,000. Nothing that Sophie described would be better if she and everyone else was paying more taxes.
Please.
Nothing that Sophie describes would be made any better if she votes Labour and they increase taxes. Like, he's kind of getting infuriated with that woman who was very, sympathetic. I felt empathy towards the woman phoning in. I didn't feel much towards Rishi Sunak. And I don't think that's an unusual position to hold in this situation. This idea that sort of people who are using food banks should be scared of Labour because they'll increase taxes. One, I think it's unfortunate, but Labour have said they won't increase taxes on anything other than sort of capital gains and things which poorer people aren't going to pay anyway. But as the woman sort of in that clip said, the reason she's struggling to afford stuff is because her mortgage payments have gone up, right? We're not really, ordinary working people in this country aren't really held down by the tax rate. Right? They're held down by their mortgage costs, by how much rent is, by how much it costs to get to and from work. You don't hear, wealthy people complain a lot about tax. You might hear some people sort of say their pay packet, they'd want it to be bigger. People do complain about taxes. But what's changed over the past 10 years isn't that people feel more weighed down by taxes. It's that their rent's gone up, their mortgage payments have gone up, the cost of food has gone up, right? So saying we're not going to increase your taxes just doesn't really work as a sort of scare story here. With just over 2 weeks to go before the general election, the SNP has launched its manifesto in Edinburgh. New SNP leader John Swinney began by laying out the party's principles for the Westminster election.
And at the very heart of our beliefs is the principle that the decisions about Scotland should be made by the people who live in Scotland. Why? For the simple reason that no one else cares as much about this wonderful country, and no one else will do a better job of taking care of it now and in the future than the people who live here. It is through independence, therefore, that we believe we can build a fairer country and a more prosperous economy we know is possible.
The SNP, of course, isn't fighting to win this general election. They're already in power in the Scottish Parliament, and in Westminster their role is inevitably limited to holding the UK government to account. The SNP can't win a majority of seats in the UK for obvious reasons. And Swinney hinted at what SNP MPs would prioritise in the Commons.
Friends, I've made clear the focus of my government will be to eradicate child poverty. The two-child benefit cap makes things much, much worse. It is the exact opposite of what the UK government should be doing. Introduced by an uncaring Conservative government, it is frankly beyond me that the prospective Labour government plan to keep this deeply damaging policy. SNP MPs will press for the two-child benefit cap to be scrapped. The future of the two-child cap is a simple test. Are you in government to help children out of poverty, or are you so morally lost that you push kids into poverty? Our choice to abolish the cap is obvious, and it is driven by our values, and we will assert that in the House of Commons.
So the SNP are clearly pitching themselves to the left of Keir Starmer's Labour Party. But to survive in this election, they also need to motivate the nationalist vote. And Swinney was clear on that front.
What this election gives people the chance to do is to intensify the pressure to secure Scottish independence and to bring that about by voting SNP in order for us to achieve a majority of Westminster seats at this election. And so if anybody out there is keen for Scotland to be an independent country, then the only vote they should cast is for the Scottish National Party, because that's the only way it's going to happen.
So what happens to the SNP vote in Scotland is one of the big trends to look out for in this election. There could be a big turnaround. According to YouGov's latest MRP poll, the SNP could find themselves down from 48 seats to a complete position of dominance to 20 seats. And Labour, for the first time since 2010, could become the party with the most seats in Scotland. Now, that would be, I think, symbolically pretty important. And I think most people would sort of think that probably puts back Scottish independence for quite a long time if the SNP are no longer the largest party there in Westminster, of course. And then there would be elections to Holyrood coming up and things would be to play for again. There was one other party that launched their manifestos today, a smaller one. The Workers' Party of Britain. Leader George Galloway spoke in Manchester, where he explained how he positioned himself in the current political landscape.
Starmer's deliberate gutting of Labour has left a vacuum which Farage is determined to fill. So we are the antidote, not just to Labour, but to reform. If there's going to be a leader of the opposition to Keir Starmer, Prime Minister, God forbid, but looking increasingly likely, then that should be me.
There are some pretty eye-catching pledges in the Workers' Party manifesto. They've said they'll raise the income tax threshold to £21,700. They also want a referendum on net zero, which are, interestingly, both pledges also made by Reform UK. One policy you won't see from Reform, though, is the Workers' Party's proposed programme of nationalisations. Galloway says they'll consider nationalising every monopoly or essential industry in the country. So that could include ports, airports, pharmaceuticals, and the military-industrial complex. And in his speech, Galloway also promised 1 million new council homes. Now, there are no costings in the party's manifesto, but here's how Galloway answered the very standard question: how are you going to pay for it?
Who's going to pay for that?
Well, maybe you missed the number I gave earlier. £12,000 per minute we're spending on nuclear weapons. That would pay for it, wouldn't it?
That's what
Per minute of every day, of every week, of every month, of every year. That would pay for that programme and much, much more.
And you're pledging to spend that on those things, just to clarify.
In the unlikely event that I am elected Prime Minister on the 4th of July, consider that.
Thank you.
So the end of that answer was fairly reasonable. In the unlikely event I'm elected Prime Minister, sure, that's what I'll spend it on. The UK does spend £6 billion a year on nuclear weapons, which is around £12,000 a minute. Now, that could presumably build a fair few council homes. I'm not sure it would quite fund all of what George Galloway was proposing. Ash, I mean, should we even be paying attention to the Workers' Party manifesto? I mean, if anything, they'll win one seat. I mean, sometimes people sort of say, Reform, the media focus too much on them. They should focus more on the Workers' Party and the like. I mean, Reform are on sort of 18% in the polls. What do you think? Could George Galloway be a player in the next Parliament?
I think that it's important to look at the Workers' Party because that might show you a direction of travel for the left and maybe even some MPs within the Labour Party. And it's important not because of the costings, and it's important not because of, what does the IFS say about their manifesto? It's really important in terms of political narrative. And I think the fact that you pointed out the similarities between Reform and the Workers' Party is really important for where do populists think that they're going to be able to pick up some votes? What's the direction of travel for the country? And I think it's quite notable that basically retreating from the idea that paying tax is a good thing to do, a good way to raise revenue, I think tells you something about the sort of ideological damage that's been done by neoliberalism. Because, of course, people do pay a lot of tax, particularly if you have to work for your wage. You pay more tax on income than you do on capital gains, and certainly more than you do on inheritance. People think it's deeply unfair, and people don't think that their tax money is going towards building anything worthwhile. So this decoupling of tax from payment of public services, I think, is something which is really, really important to keep an eye on.
I suppose the SNP, if they're no longer the largest party in Scotland, that will be quite totemic, right? That the idea that Labour could be the largest party in Scotland seemed, fairly impossible just a couple of years ago.
Well, absolutely. The big change for Labour in Scotland came in 2015. That's when you sort of saw this period of total SNP dominance. The challenge for the SNP is that, yes, they might make some commitments which put them to the left of Labour on popular policies as well, like the two-child benefit cap. However, they are, like the Conservatives in a way, struggling with the fact that they are incumbents. So they're being measured not just up against the other parties, they're being measured up against their own record. And that puts them, I think, in a very, very difficult position.
This was another instance in which Keir Starmer has been extraordinarily lucky because his opposition on both sides of the border completely self-imploded. So obviously the Conservatives, you all know that story very well. Boris Johnson does Partygate, Liz Truss gets elected and destroys the economy, and then Rishi Sunak gets elected, who's a complete inept idiot. And then in Scotland, I suppose in a way a more dramatic story, which is Nicola Sturgeon falls and there's a police investigation into her husband. Then obviously the SNP have now had a few leaders in quick succession. As Israel's atrocities in Gaza have become ever more clear, committed Zionists have been forced to dismiss an ever wider range of international institutions, as Mehdi Hasan found out at a recent debate.
I want you to also offer defense of international institutions at this moment as it relates to holding the state of Israel to account.
I have just one sentence to say about that, is that the entire world wants a ceasefire, and the United States and Israel and, I don't know, the Micronesia and whatever else don't, right? The entire world takes a very different view, unfortunately, to the people in this room and to Douglas and Natasha. The International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the UNHCR, UNICEF, Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, Christian Aid. Yep, you're booing. What does it come to when you're booing Oxfam? What does that tell you about yourselves? You're sitting here booing Oxfam to defend Benjamin Netanyahu. Let me just deal with something you just said. You talked about debunking propaganda. First of all, you can't even get Israeli propaganda straight. The Israeli government's own security agency, Shin Bet, investigated what you just said and said, no, we found no evidence that workers from Gaza were involved in the October 7th attack. Oh, Shin Bet are lying. They're booing Shin Bet, the Israeli security service. Got it.
So they did a poll sort of at the beginning of that debate asking sort of who the audience were, what they thought. The debate was about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And it's very clear that the majority of the audience were Zionists. And this is something I think we've come to see over and over again since October the 7th, which is the moment an institution criticizes Israel or sort of says what it's doing in Gaza is horrific and many innocent people are dying and they're struggling to get food in there, people try and sort of delegitimize the institution. And, you know, I don't think that's a completely unreasonable strategy in general. Whenever I hear a claim, right, I want to know, okay, who's making the claim? What are their interests? What are the methods? But I think the point that Mehdi Hasan made well there is that when you've got this list of institutions, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, you've got the UNHCR, so the UN Human Rights Commission, and you've got Oxfam, you've got all of these human rights organizations, all of these aid organizations, right? These are people who, you know, their organizations are generally sort of committed to trying to keep people alive. And if you think there's a conspiracy among all of them to make up that there's a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza when really there isn't, it's come to something. Of course, at the end, sort of the cherry on the cake was that he was saying that Shin Bet, clearly another person on the panel, had sort of pointed out or made the claim that people who had work permits in Israel had been part of October the 7th. He says even Shin Bet, which is an Israeli security force, has debunked that, and everyone boos. He's like, you won't even believe Israel's own security forces. It's just this see no evil, hear no evil sort of attitude, I suppose. As I say, Mehdi Hasan was speaking. It was a monk debate in Canada. The motion under contention was whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And Hasan was up against some very committed defenders of Israel, including the right-wing pundit Douglas Murray.
There is no reason why a Jewish state should not be able to live side by side with another Arab-Palestinian state. Okay? And I'm glad that Gideon brought up Oslo. The only reason that there is not a Palestinian state today, not the Palestinian Authority, which runs most of the West Bank, or Hamas, that was given the Gaza and then decided to do, well, we know what they decided to do with 18 years of international funding from this country and others. Not that, but if they were given another state, there is no reason, if they brought their children up to love life and to live by their neighbors, if they educated their children into learning instead of hate, there is no reason why they could not live in a state beside a Jewish state. And there's no reason why Zionism opposes that, and it doesn't.
It's kind of scary to see that get a big round of applause. You know, the idea that Palestinian parents don't bring up their children to love life, right? They've brought up their children to be inherently hateful people, and that's why this genocidal war against them is essentially justified. I mean, that seems to be what Douglas Murray is suggesting, right? He denies the genocidal war, of course. But the idea that the only reason there hasn't been peace in the Middle East is not because the Israelis have a stated aim of settling the entirety of Greater Israel. Like, that's literally what the Prime Minister of Israel says he wants when he holds up maps at the UN, which says Israel and it's all the territory, including Palestine, right? No, he's completely blind to that. Oh, no, Israel really want a two-state solution. The only problem is that the Palestinians raise their kids to hate life. It's so, you know, you can call it racist or hate-filled. It's also just incredibly implausible, right? It's just not a persuasive argument, but it still gets a round of applause there. As I say, it was a sort of predominantly Zionist audience that they were speaking to. Murray was debating alongside Natasha Hausdorff. She's from Lawyers for Israel, and she said this.
I have to begin with a debating tip coming from a land with a culture of a rich history of debate. And that is that in debates, it is for the proposition to define the motion. And Douglas did that for you, loud and clear. Mehdi seems to think that he can redefine anti-Zionism without you noticing, but the proposition are not going to allow him to pull the wool over your eyes and conflate Zionism with politics. Who has the right to define Zionism? Well, apart from the proposition in this debate, because that's how the rules work. Would you ask a misogynist to define misogyny? You wouldn't ask a sex offender to define rape. You wouldn't ask the KKK to define anti-black racism. So why, when it comes to the Jews, would you let the anti-Zionists define anti-Zionism? No, ladies and gentlemen, no minority should have its identity dictated to it.
That's a very strange argument for a lawyer to make, right? Because the question she actually said, I don't know if she was misspeaking, but she said, who gets to define Zionism? That's what she said. Who gets to define Zionism? Then she says, misogynists don't get to define misogyny. Racists don't get to define racism. And Zionists don't get to define, oh, shit, that doesn't actually work. Zionists don't get to define Zionism. Ah! Right. Of course, personally, I don't think any group should get a monopoly on defining anything, right? I think it's sort of silly to say, oh, only the victims of something should be able to define what they're experiencing. I think that's a route to sort of a complete impasse, because it means that you can't have rational argument about anything. However, if there is any logic to this kind of politics, it's that when defining a political project or a form of oppression, we should pay particular attention to its victims. And I do think this is reasonable. For example, when defining sexism, women shouldn't have a monopoly on any discussion. We should be able to have rational debate regardless on who is the person speaking. But it would make sense to pay special attention to the views of women. Similar when defining anti-Semitism, right? Jews shouldn't have a monopoly on any discussion or definition, but we should, of course, pay special attention to Jews. And what does that mean for defining Zionism? Well, if we're paying special attention to the victims of a political project or movement, that would surely be the Palestinians. Now, unfortunately, there weren't any Palestinians on that panel, but the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy spoke with some real passion on how Palestinians grow up to think about Zionism.
Each of you ask yourself, if you would have been born Palestinian and live all your life under the brutal, maybe the most brutal regime today in the world. I saw it. When you would wake up in the morning and see your parents beaten and go to sleep at night and troops will come to your home and kidnap your father or your mother in front of your eyes on a daily basis, and I know what I'm talking about. Don't tell me about facts, yeah? What do you think you would have felt toward the people who does it to you? What do you think? It has nothing to do with education system. They don't need education system to hate us. Okay, we make them hating us.
It's a really, really strong, powerful response to basically what Douglas Murray was saying, right? They raise their kids to hate life. No, their kids grow up in a situation where they're denied basic rights by a neighboring country, where the only time they see Israelis is when there's sort of security people pointing guns at them or kicking them out of their homes, right? You don't have to teach people like that to hate Israel. They're going to learn that from their experience of having guns pointed at them and their homes knocked down. Ash, I mean, people watching that might think that seemed like a quite strange environment. You sort of had this big braying audience, these four big names debating. They're booing anytime anyone says something critical of Israel. I know you've done a monk debate, haven't you? You've been in those chairs. Your one was about liberalism, I think. What was your sense watching what was going on there?
Well, my debate was a lot less rowdy. So it was about liberalism. I was debating Jacob Rees-Mogg and George F. Will, and we ended up winning the debate because we swayed a bigger chunk of the audience. I feel very proud of that. But it was a much less challenging environment generally, because quite clearly you had an audience which was very supportive of Zionism and intensely hostile towards any criticism of the actually existing state of Israel. And that makes it very difficult to make points which are going to be heard by somebody else, because effectively you've got someone who has hermetically sealed themselves within an alternative information universe, and you're sort of knocking on the door and saying, well, no, this is some other information, that they're not going to hear it because their entire worldview is dependent on them not hearing it. Listening to the contributions of the lady from Lawyers for Israel and also Douglas Murray, it is astonishing to me how intellectually dishonest contemporary Zionists are compared to the originators of the Zionist movement. So, not that long ago, I read an essay which was written by one of the early Zionists called, I can't, I'm going to be absolutely butchering the pronunciation, so very, very sorry. I think it's Zev Jabotinsky. And Jabotinsky wrote an essay called The Iron Wall. And what he said is this, and he said, write this as a Zionist, as an ardent, militant Zionist. Basically, the point of the Iron Wall was, if you think that there's a vegetarian option for Zionism, dream on. There is one way that a Jewish majority state is going to be established in an Arab majority territory, and that's going to be through use of violence. We have to militarize this Zionist state. We have to build an iron wall. There will be violent resistance to it because that's natural. It is in the nature of anyone who is being colonized to resist colonial settlers. This is what he writes in The Iron Wall. The difference between me and Jabotinsky is that he assigns a very different moral value to the act of that militarization and the act of establishing a Zionist state on top of an Arab majority territory by force. He says, well, I think that's a morally justified thing to do, but either way you look at it, it's going to take violence, there's going to be resistance, and it's perfectly natural for there to be resistance. It's not because they hate us, it's not because we're Jews, it's because we're taking land and resources from them. Similarly, Theodor Herzl, again, one of the original Zionists, described the project as a settler colonial project. Now, that is miles away from how Zionists present the project of the State of Israel and what Israel's doing. And instead, it's all about kind of transferring what is a deeply European phenomenon, which is anti-Semitism, and making that a Palestinian issue and saying, well, look, these people are motivated by an ideological and religious hatred for the Jews. That's why they resist the state of Israel. That's why you have an organization like Hamas. Now, I'm not saying that Hamas isn't anti-Semitic, but to say that the causal factor here is anti-Semitism is a complete and utter sham. The causal factor is that Palestinians have been robbed, that they have been brutalized, that they have been ethnically cleansed, that they have been subject to massacres.
Labour under Starmer has done a lot to reassure Britain's wealthy, and it appears to be working. John Caldwell is the founder of Phones for You, and according to the Sunday Times Rich List, is worth 1.5 billion quid.
Over the last 2 or 3 months, I've looked at the Labour manifesto, looked at what they stand for, and gradually, slowly and grudgingly, after 50 years of Conservative support, moved their way. The real clincher was on Friday. I was in a business conference that they were holding, and there was 50 chief executives of some of the biggest companies in the UK, representing £4 billion worth of market cap. Sorry, it was much more than that. The number was 4 trillion, not 4 billion, 4 trillion pounds of market cap. And the, not camaraderie, but the empathy from Rachel Reeves and the other people in the Labour Party and these senior businessmen was clear.
So you heard that. This is a man who has supported the Tories for 50 years, right? So even Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson were too left-wing for him. So Peter Mandelson, who said, a New Labour intensely relaxed about the rich getting filthy rich, right? That was still too left-wing for that billionaire. However, now the empathy of Rachel Reeves towards Britain's chief executives has won him over.
What Keir has done, as far as I can see, has taken all the left out of the Labour Party, and he's come out with a brilliant set of values and principles and ways of growing Britain in complete alignment with my views as a commercial capitalist.
That's actually perhaps a more honest message than you'll hear in much of the Liberal press at the moment. Keir Starmer has done more than Tony Blair to expunge the left from the Labour Party, and that's meant that its objectives are completely in line with commercial capitalists. They're not just sort of merely consistent, not something that commercial capitalists can tolerate and work with. No, it is exactly the same as the interests of commercial capitalists. And it's important sort of repeating, including once committed Tories, right? And Caudwell certainly counts as a once committed Tory. As well as backing the party for 50 years, he's been a major donor. In fact, Caudwell was the party's biggest donor, giving them £500,000 in 2019. And he wasn't shy then about his reasoning for his Tory support. So earlier in 2019, he'd pledged he would move to tax-free Monaco if Corbyn were to get into power and bring in higher taxes. Now, Monaco would be a fitting destination for Caudwell, who clearly has a taste for luxury. The billionaire owns an £85 million Mayfair townhouse, 2 super yachts, a private jet, and a £12 million manor house near where he grew up in Stoke-on-Trent. But are Caudwell's political judgments as valuable as his financial assets? Well, as well as backing Boris Johnson, Caudwell was a big fan of Liz Truss, who tried to help the super rich but ended up crashing the economy. And on Newsnight, co-panellist Isabel Oakeshott challenged Caudwell on his shifting political commitments.
I think it's fine to change your mind. You know, the facts change, personnel change at the top and so on. So I think that's fine. But it does strike me as if you are a little bit all over the place on who you've supported. I mean, did I hear correctly?
Nobody less all over the place than me that you'll
Did
you
support Liz Truss's?
ever know in your life.
Did you support Liz Truss's agenda?
I'm direct. I did, and there was a reason for that because
really
I was so
radically different to the economic agenda of the Labour Party.
No, it wasn't.
It really is.
No, look. Liz Truss was going for growth, GDP growth.
Yeah.
She got it all wrong.
Yeah.
I did not support Rishi. The only alternative was Liz Truss or Rishi. I chose what I view to be the lesser of the two evils, and she screwed it up and she made a mess of it.
Right.
That's it. That's fact. You know, how many times do we get a political decision wrong? Now, what you're saying is I've probably got it wrong with Labour. Well, if I have, God help. God help.
Being a bit naive.
No, I'm not
and
naive at all.
Obviously, I don't want to lecture you on that because you're a very successful guy.
If I'm naive, how did I build a business in a tough environment for 20 years that made a 1.5 billion sellout? Was I the luckiest guy on earth, or did I fight like fury?
How much of that was under a Labour government?
Or did I fight like fury, and did I make shrewd, commercial, wise decisions?
I'm 100%.
I love that sort of rhetorical device. There's nobody less all over the place in the whole world than me. Right? It's very Trumpian. So he says, there's no one more honest in the whole world than me. Right? It's like, why don't you just say, I mean, you're clearly a bit all over the place, right? You went from backing Boris Johnson to Liz Truss to Keir Starmer. Now, that doesn't completely delegitimize your point of view, but to say you're the least all over the place person in the whole entire world does make you sound a bit childish, I suppose. I mean, we should be clear. Clearly, this guy is smart. He didn't inherit all his money. He came from a working class background, built Phones for You out of nothing. He's clearly got a lot of business acumen, right? The guy's not an idiot, even if he does speak in a sort of a bit like a boastful child. Might he be a little bit cynical, though, right? So she's saying he's naive. Perhaps it's, well, it's not the Labour Party who are being naive because I think they know what's going on here. But perhaps people who are impressed by his support for Labour because it means, they're a strong party of government are being a little bit naive. Because could it be that this billionaire with his £95 million or £85 million mansion in Mayfair who keeps considering going to Monaco isn't really aligning with the Labour Party because he thinks they'll be best for the country, but is aligning or sort of standing behind the Labour Party because he's pretty sure they're definitely going to win the next general election and wants to have an in with them, right? That's often how these things work. There's no point in being a billionaire who comes out in favour of Sunak right now when his party's going to win 100 seats. If you're someone with sort of a sense for business, sort of where's the right place to invest, you're going to invest in Labour right now because you're going to invest in the winning team. Ash, Labour have been fairly celebratory of John Caudwell sort of coming to their aid, sort of at the beginning of a BBC report with the political editor yesterday. He sort of said, Labour have been keen for me to come and do this interview, right? So they're pushing this guy out there. Is his support something they should be, celebrating?
I think that it's something that is potentially a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, when you're riding high in the polls and he wants to stick the boot into the Conservative government, and he also maybe wants the ear of senior Labour Party policymakers, all the interests are in alignment. But let's say in government, Labour perhaps want to do something different. Maybe they do want to fiddle with how capital gains tax works or something. Then you've got this man who you've empowered to wax lyrical about your excellent relationship with business, to come along and stick the boot in against you, because there's nothing that the media love more than I didn't leave the Labour Party left me narrative. I mean, Maureen Lipman, I think, left the Labour Party about 17 times. It didn't stop her from getting a newspaper write-up each and every time. So I think that that's something which is potentially very short-sighted. I think you're right to point out that he's a canny operator. He's positioning himself well for an incoming government, but that doesn't come for free. And I think the person who's got the more to fear from it is in fact Rachel Reeves rather than John Caldwell.
I think when you're worth £1.5 billion, there's not much you'd fear, right? You're not going to run out of money. And you can sell one of your super yachts. You've still got another one. He doesn't seem like a man to me who's going to be worrying too much. So I do sort of take your position that probably Rachel Reeves has more to lose out of this. John Caldwell is, of course, though, not the only billionaire who's backing Keir Starmer. Jim Ratcliffe, he's even richer than John Caldwell. He's a chemical boss, and with a net worth of £12 billion, is currently Britain's second richest man.
The Conservatives now have had, a fairly long stint, and they've put forward a whole series of prime ministers that haven't been terribly successful, really, to be honest, the last 4 or so. So, I think the UK, everybody in the UK now, you can see that the mood in the UK, everybody's ready for a change. They've had enough. So it's, I think I've met Keir Starmer a couple of times. I like Keir. I think he'll do a very sensible job.
That was chemical boss Jim Ratcliffe, who might have even less skin in the game than Paul Caldwell. And that's because he already left Britain to, you guessed it, tax-free Monaco. Ratcliffe left the UK in 2020 when he was then actually the country's richest person. It was especially controversial at the time because Ratcliffe had been a prominent supporter of Brexit, who was all for Britain's independence. Then when we leave the EU, he's like, oh, I'll piss off now. Ratcliffe's move to Monaco followed in the footsteps of Sir Philip Green. It's unclear whether Labour would put out a press release if Mr. Green decided to back Keir Starmer. Now, for balance, we should say that others are reporting some millionaires are in fact afraid of a Starmer government. So CNBC have reported that millionaires are abandoning the UK in droves. The claim comes from research by the Henley and Partners consultancy group, who say Britain will experience a net loss of 9,500 high net worth individuals in 2024. It would be double the amount recorded last year, itself a record high. The only country they project to see more millionaires leave is China, which is a much bigger country, presumably has many more millionaires. The CNBC article says this: the projections mark a stark turnaround for Britain, once viewed as a prime location for the world's super rich. Henley, a consultancy that tracks migration trends, noted that between the 1950s and the early 2000s, the country saw swathes of rich families relocate to its shores from across mainland Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, often to invest their corrupt earnings in Mayfair and the like, not necessarily something to be celebrating. However, Henley and Partners say that is, of course, now changing. The direction of travel is in the other direction. This trend began to reverse, they say, around a decade ago, as more millionaires began to leave the country and fewer came in. Notably, during the 6-year period from 2017 to 2023 post-Brexit, the UK lost a total of 16,500 millionaires to migration. Provisional estimates for 2024 are even more concerning. Ash, we got sort of one data point from this consultancy. Often these consultancies, I think, are just looking for a news article, so I'm never sure how much we should trust them. But I suppose their information about the people who actually did leave last year probably is more accurate than their projections. We're hearing a record number of millionaires are leaving at the same time these billionaires are backing Starmer. What's going on? How shall we make sense of it?
I wonder if part of it is that Britain isn't actually a particularly attractive place to be super duper rich if you are super duper rich. Britain is a good place to deal with your money, to use the financial services of the City of London to, you know, I'm not saying hide your assets, but basically hide your assets. It's got a great real estate market. If you're super rich, means that you can convert cash, which devalues, into property, which appreciates in value. But it's not, it wouldn't be my first choice if I was mega, mega rich, because we've got a kind of weird hybrid where, yes, you've got, you know, quite a big public sector, but it's also in decline. So if you are super duper mega rich, you can't go entirely private for the entirety of care, for instance. There isn't private healthcare for A&E and for intensive care. So you may as well go to a country which has got even less of a public sector, but has a much more expansive private sector, which is capable of catering to every single one of your needs. I mean, you might prefer to live in a place where you can have armed security. You might prefer to live in a place where, I don't know, maybe it's nicer to sail around on your super yacht. You might prefer to live in a place where rates of taxation, particularly for things like capital gains and for income, are even lower. But all of this is speculation on my part. I'm just trying to think about, why would you, if you're a millionaire, leave this country? I mean, what do you think? Speaking as a multimillionaire, Michael, why would you want to leave?
If I were a multimillionaire, only my civic duty and my real patriotism would keep me in this country, paying British taxes. Otherwise, I could imagine living in a yacht somewhere. I don't know. I suppose there's a lot going on in this country. I'll never be a multimillionaire, so we don't need to worry about it. I'm not going anywhere. Thank you, Ash, for joining me on tonight's show.
There was a sort of look of resignation in your eyes for that. I was like, don't worry about it. I'm not going anywhere. You know, there's a kind of pathos to it.
I'll still be here, you know. Thank you everyone for watching tonight. I love being here. Love you guys. You've been watching Novara Media. We'll be back tomorrow. Good night.